Today's episode is brought to you in part by Between the Covers, a podcast for listeners, readers, and writers who seek out in-depth conversations about literature and about the questions of craft that arise in the creative process. Between the Covers is one of my personal favorite podcasts in any genre, and host David Naiman has had some of the smartest, most detailed conversations about literature that I've been lucky to hear. Past guests have included Zadie Smith, George Saunders, and Ted Chiang in fiction, Maggie Nelson, Carmen Maria Machado, and Ursula K. Le Guin in nonfiction, and Mary Ruffel, C.A. Conrad, and Layli Longsoldier in poetry. Subscribe to Between the Covers with your favorite podcast app or visit the podcast archive at tinhouse.com/podcasts for more information about the show. Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 105. Today's guest is Brandon Taylor. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome writer Brandon Taylor back to the show. Brandon Taylor is the senior editor of Electric Literature's Recommended Reading and a staff writer at Literary Hub. His writing has received fellowships from Lambda Literary Foundation, Kimbilio Fiction, and the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Iowa, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop in fiction. Now, longtime listeners will remember that I had Brandon on the show back in 2017 in episode 38. That was one of my favorite conversations I've had on the show, not least because, in addition to Brandon being one of my favorite living writers, he's also just, I think, a delightful conversationalist. So I'm just so happy to have him back on the show today talking about his debut novel, Real Life. Now, I know that it's only February, but I have to tell you, I am confident that this is one of the books of 2020. It is just an utterly gorgeous book, one of the absolute best I have read in, I don't even know how long. And I loved this book. Real Life is the story of Wallace, who is a black gay biochemistry grad student at an unnamed university in the upper Midwest. We follow Wallace through the events of really just a few days, and we see this reserved, sort of alienated young man as he winds up having a series of confrontations and interactions with his group of friends who are mostly his classmates. There are moments of casual cruelty, of violent passion, and of deep tenderness, and all of it is rendered in the most wonderfully written prose. I just can't say enough good stuff about this book. I put a link in the show notes to where you can buy yourself a copy, and obviously I highly recommend it. Now, coming up, Brandon will be appearing in a number of cities for the Real Life Book Tour. He'll be at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. tomorrow, February 27th. Then on February 28th, he'll be at Books Are Magic in New York. On February 29th, he's at the Penn Book Center in Philadelphia. And then on March 12th, he'll be at A Room of One's Own in Madison, Wisconsin. You can find a full listing of Brandon's tour dates at the Penguin Random House website, and there's a link in the show notes for that. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Brandon Taylor. So how are you today?
I'm well. It's very cold outside, and so I've been braving that. But other than the immense cold, I've been good, I think.
Well, at least there's an opportunity for sweaters, it seems like.
Oh, yes. It's been peak sweater weather, though I feel like it's going away from sweater weather and toward parka weather.
So I think that you already know this. I'm sure that I've told you probably more than once, but just to tell you, more or less in person, I just adore your book, and I love it so much. And the thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how the last time we talked for the show, you were like a very committed short story writer, and you would go on and on about how you were never going to write a novel, and now you've written a novel, and it's amazing. So I guess one of the things I wanted to start off talking about, other than just giving you a hard time about things that you said several years ago at this point, is sort of, what do you find to be the difference in writing a novel versus writing short stories?
I mean, you could fill up the sky with the differences between writing short stories and writing novels. I think most obviously short stories are shorter And so the kinds of things that you can do in that form are different. Like the number of sort of conceits you can draw on are different for short stories than for novels. Writing a short story in the second person and a sort of shifting array of modular components is like one thing, but to sort of write a 400-page novel that way it's a different beast. And so I think writing short stories, readers come to them with different expectations because they are shorter. And so you can play with those expectations in a way that's different than the novel. As for like writing them, I mean, for me, writing short stories it's like, shooting an arrow. It's like you draw it and then you shoot it, and there's this sort of instantaneous release, more or less. Like I'm not a writer who spends years and years chiseling away at a mountainside to get a short story out of it. And writing a novel is, it's sort of like a prolonged period of concentration that requires like different faculties just in terms of being able to sort of pay attention for longer, I guess. But like ironically, novels, I think there are more places in a novel where you can kind of be fuzzy and not pay as close attention. Whereas in a short story, if there's any place where your attention drops, it's, the kiss of death.
I mean, you are a writer who, does pay so much attention. I think that your writing, something that I've always appreciated about your writing is how detailed it is, like how much you think about like everything that goes into your writing. And it's so clear when you're reading, whether it's a short story or whether it's this novel, that the attention to detail in the language is something that's obviously very important to you. And so, I mean, I'm just interested to hear you talking about this. I mean, one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about it is that talking about the different conceits, things that you can do, I still also found that in this novel, there is a fair amount of shifting and stuff that goes on. Like one of the chapters is in first person, which I gasped when I got to that chapter. But also, there are times when you shift in tenses as well. Like the beginning of it is in past tense, and towards the end, it sort of shifts into the present tense. And that I thought was a really interesting stylistic decision to sort of, have this much movement, not just in terms of story or in terms of character, but in terms of language as well. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very strange. Whenever I talk to a friend of mine about my writing, I say, well, you're the kind of writer who writes like you went to college, and I am a writer of the common people. And my friend is always like, Brandon, you absolutely write like you went to college. Like, are you not aware that your novel is like a very deeply weird like amalgam of these very cosmopolitan ideas? And I'm always like, no, it's a very straightforward novel. It just like changes tenses sometimes. And also there's like a really intense register shift in the middle, and it's like doing weird stuff with like POV, yeah, but it's like regular, it's not like fancy. And I guess in sort of terms of writing the novel, I wrote the first section and then started the second section of the novel, and there was a tense shift, and I thought, okay, either I need to sort of go back and rewrite the first chunk of this to match, or I just go with it. And normally I'm the kind of person who absolutely says, yes, go back and rewrite it so it all matches, because I'm a very sort of tightly gripped person in that respect. But I was like, if I do that, I'm going to waste so much time. So I have absolutely got to get this thing done. So I just sort of released into it. And so the moments where the book kind of, has these shifts in POV or tone or in tense even, like those were moments where the novel seemed to require it in some way. And so I just let it happen. And when I was looking at the whole draft, having finished it, I was like, no, I'm really happy with this, because it felt urgent. It sort of felt like an urgent property of the story itself, that it had to be told in this way. And it didn't feel like, yes, it's jarring initially, but that jarring is also replicated in the story itself. Like there are moments of, emotional phase changes that the character goes through that sort of gets mirrored in the technique used to render the text. And so, yeah, there's a lot of shifting around, and, there are things that came, I think, from the story itself, and from the story sort of in demanding to be told a certain way.
I mean, certainly, like when we reached that first person chapter, that was something that I noticed right away. But things like changing tense, was the kind of thing where I didn't realize that it had happened until like I was at least a few pages or sometimes many pages in. And then I was like, wait a second, was this always? And then I had to kind of go back and check and see. To me, it was something that was really an interesting experience as a reader because everything really felt like it fit, like it all, even though there was all this sort of tonal difference or like you say, changing emotional register pretty wildly right in the middle of the story, it all works together really well. It doesn't feel like disparate parts that are sort of stitched together. Rather, it just feels like a cohesive whole. And I found that, I don't know, impressive.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I wouldn't want it to, my editor talks about it as being the sort of two-toned room. Like nobody wants to sort of walk into a room where like the carpet is like two different colors. And I was always afraid of that, but he's like, but you have not made a two-tone room. Don't worry. It all kind of fits really well together. And, it was something that I did grapple with. I did sort of go back and forth about whether to go back and make everything match, but that just felt somehow less true to the story. And so to me, it all sort of made sense. And I'm glad that it did to you too, I guess.
Yeah, it really did. I mean, I think that there is this really interesting sort of movement between the story feeling at times almost sort of like a fable, like the parts in the past tense feel like there's a lyricism to the whole book, but the parts that are rendered in past tense have this almost more sort of fable-like quality, where the parts that are in present tense have this really more immediate sort of, I don't know, a different kind of urgency to them. I thought it was really effective. One of the things that I also wanted to talk about, which is right there in the title, is the concept of real life, which to me seemed like really important to the story. One of the things that happens, like it's in the first chapter, and it's fairly early in the first chapter, these characters are all sitting around having lunch together or having a meal together by the lake. And this one character who kind of comes off as like one of the bigger assholes in the story, I think, is just kind of shitting on all of these other biochem students. He's not a biochem student. And he's saying, you couldn't hack it in the real world, in real life. And yet this is a story I feel like that is really, I think that what I was saying before too about that sort of fable-like quality, there are so many ways that the story, I think, is sort of asking us, what does this mean? What is real life? That sort of fable-like quality can at times make you feel as a reader like a little bit of a remove from something that's really real. But I think that that's something that's also echoed in how Wallace sort of thinks about his life. So I kind of wanted to get a little bit about your thoughts on what this, what the book has to say about what is real life.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's interesting to sort of think about this now, because when I was working on this novel, I was, a graduate student in biochemistry, and I was working 15-hour days, and there was something about that life which felt real to me in a way, because I was sort of on my own. I was paying my own rent. I was paying bills. I sort of, had a cell phone plan for the first time in my life. And I was doing my own schedule and being responsible for myself. And so there was a way in which it felt like adulthood and like real life to me, but also the decisions that I was having to make weren't about the sort of greater course of my life. They were ultimately the decisions that a student makes about their education. Like there's something about those very adult moments in my life while I was working in that lab that weren't like really interfacing with the world. They were sort of learning how to operate in academia, which is kind of like a simulation of real life, where the stakes are really high in terms of like intellectual property and intellectual discovery, but in sort of terms of surviving in the world, the stakes could not be lower. Like, who cares if your gel didn't work? And so I really wanted to, like in the novel, turn over this question of like, what does it mean to live a real life? Because one of the things that we would often say in lab would be like, oh, well, they're like a real person, like the real people, like referring to the people who weren't in academia, who like lived in Madison, like the people who worked at the biotech firm downtown, or who worked at banks or whatever that you would see out at bars. We would sort of look at them and be like, oh, real people. And so it's this idea of like, what is like a real life? You know, is a real life determined by the set of responsibilities that you have? Or is a real life determined by some sort of arbitrary societal metric? Or is real life a life that you have created for yourself out of your circumstances? You know, like a real life is any and all of these things, and it is also none of them. There's also this sort of thread of thought amongst a lot of the STEM students I knew that like it couldn't be like real life because we weren't in any danger. And there was something about the proximity to danger or precarity that signaled whether or not what you were doing was like real or not. Like there was something about, you know, your proximity to being thrown out into the world with no safety nets that felt like quote unquote real life. And there's certainly something very classist in that sort of suggestion as well. And when I was a student, you know, in biochemistry, we kept talking a lot about prolonged adolescence, that we were all just overgrown teenagers and that our adolescence had like grown this mullet, and the mullet was grad school that was like shielding us from the larger world. And so, you know, like the novel, I think, tries to understand both, you know, what was meant when Cole, I think it is, says that really Vincent says that really awful thing to Wallace about you guys would never be able to cut it. You don't even have insurance or something like that. And sort of taking that and sort of turning it over and over and over and trying to figure out what it is to live a life that is real. And like, what does it mean to sort of realize that the life you've created isn't actually what you had hoped it would be.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting too, because Vincent also later in the story, he gets this moment where, you know, after Wallace has sort of done this sort of, I don't know, he's sort of dropped this conversational bomb at this party, where afterwards Vincent, who is, I guess in some ways, I don't know, it's a weird word to use, like the victim of that bomb, but I don't know, using the word victim seems a little strange in this context. He goes up to Wallace and says, "This is real life. You can't just do this to people," kind of thing. Like he says, I actually have it marked out. He says, "This is real life, Wallace. Do you understand that? This is real life." And so it's funny to me that he is this person who gets, you know, at sort of bookends the story in like, this isn't real life, but this is real life. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think though to Vincent, he's like an outsider, right? And so he's looking at them, he sort of sees them as like these overgrown children, and he's like got a real, like a quote unquote real job, and he's not in school, and he has to clock in at like 8 o'clock every morning, and he's really grumpy about that. And he's looking at them, and to him, they have it easy because they are sort of still in quote unquote school. And he feels that Wallace has infringed upon his relationship, which feels like very real and urgent and important to him. And he thinks that Wallace is just acting out the petty dramas of childhood. And so when he's like, "This is real life, Wallace," he's sort of trying to assert Wallace doesn't understand the rules of the game he's trying to play, even though that sort of undermines his whole point that it isn't a game, I think. But yeah, Vincent's such a strange character.
I mean, I think that question of whether or not Wallace understands the rules of the game, or even whether it is a game, I think to me that's this sort of an important question about the book. And because I feel like Wallace is this really interesting character in that he seems to be very aware of like other people's internal processes, but at the same time kind of very unaware of what his own internal processes are at times. And I think that there is this way that he sort of, what am I trying to say here? It almost doesn't feel like he sees the things that they are doing as real, you know, at the same time as that he does see them as real. This isn't the most articulate way of saying this, I don't think, but I find that question of like the way that Wallace can be in the world and be so aware all the time, and yet be his own motivations at time can be kind of opaque to him. It seems like a difficult thing to write, but also two, just sort of like a difficult thing to imagine. I don't know. I found it really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think that's two things. Like, one, my sort of central fiction ethos is that we are often the deepest mysteries to ourselves, and often we are very opaque to ourselves. And sort of that being my sort of main guiding approach to character is to sort of afford characters a space to be a mystery, like a blank screen to themselves. And the other thing is that I do think that Wallace is a person who, by various circumstances, has like migrated into a space that he was never meant to occupy, and like never meant to occupy, meaning because society doesn't want people like him in such spaces. And so what he's learning to do, and sort of what Wallace has always had to do throughout his entire life, is sort of read the room very carefully and to sort of piece together the rules of the space he's in, because no one's just going to tell him anything. And I think what you see is that, you know, he's like a character who's very good at reading the textures of what people are doing and sort of seeing the motivations that are behind those actions or words. But at the same time, he's operating from an incomplete knowledge of the game he's in. And so it's this like really curious, like double consciousness of knowing that you exist in this space as a set of assumptions made about you, and needing to sort of try to figure out what those assumptions are so that you can either play to them or not play to them. But at the same time, feeling like you don't really understand yourself or understand other people or how it all fits together. And so, you know, he sometimes does and says things that he should not say or do, sometimes on purpose and sometimes not knowing that he shouldn't say or do those things, because he thinks he's doing something good or doing something right or trying not to do harm. But in sort of doing that, he ends up making a bigger mess, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I think with Wallace, he's just a person who has figured out how to play the game, but he doesn't quite understand all of the rules. And part of that is just because he has had to try so hard just to get to the starting line.
Yeah. This really bears on, I think, the way that race is sort of presented in this book, which is something that felt very real to me. And I guess not just race, but, you know, also other forms of marginalization, because Wallace is Black. He's also gay. He's from a poor background as compared to a lot of the people in the program with him, sort of coming from more affluent backgrounds. And the ways in which he is made to constantly be second guessing himself by other people was just like, it was so infuriating, but also like, yeah, of course, this is what we all go through, right? Like, if you're not a white person, then white people are going to say shitty things to you and then make you feel like, well, but was it really that, or was it really not that? And so we all spend this, incredible amount of time and energy, like trying to figure out what other people meant by what they did and said. That whole thing here, combined with the way that Wallace sometimes doesn't completely understand himself, like I found that it really replicated the experience for me of being in these situations where, because he doesn't completely understand himself, because maybe I don't completely understand myself, sometimes he will be in these situations with people where the immediate sort of confrontational nature of the interaction puts you on his side. But then afterwards, as he is going back to reconsider the situation and wonder about it, is basically exactly the point at which I would be wondering about it as well, you know? And I really loved seeing that in this book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me that when I was writing the book, I mean, when I set out to write it, I thought, okay, I want to write a campus novel because they're my favorite genre of book. But instead of like it being the normal campus novel, the character is going to be Black and gay because I'm tired of reading about straight white people in college. And so like that's what I was going to do. And I never thought about race when I was writing the book. Like I never sort of thought, and this is the part where the race comes in, it's going to be great. And it wasn't until I was revising the book that I found myself sort of including more and more, like really excavating that element of his experience, because I thought that, you know, sort of in hindsight, I could see places where in the first draft I had been maybe too, not forgiving, but like a little, like I didn't do enough to replicate the experience of what it's like to exist in a place that causes you to constantly sort of second guess, you know, wait, was that racism? Was it though? Like what, like the sort of second guessing you do of yourself. And so I wanted to put more of that into the book. And it was, with each pass I did revising the book, that became a more and more explicit part of the story. And what I'll say about that is that, I mean, it's amazing what people will say to you. And when you call them on it, they act as though you've accosted them by forcing them to sort of sit in what it is they've done. And the way that they get around that is by sort of at every step of the process, causing you to constantly sort of interrogate whether or not you are the right adjudicator of whether something awful has happened to you. Like there's a very strange kind of programming that happens in spaces like that to make you less hostile to the oppressive overculture. And I think there's a moment in the book where Wallace is like, it's so funny that white people want to be the judges of whether or not something is racist when they're the ones being racist. Like, why is that the system that we have set up? And so I think part of the difficulty in getting that on the page was it involves constantly revisiting the accost and thinking it through first in one way and then another way and then another way. And it becomes, tedious to sort of go through that just in life, but then to sort of put that on the page. And so then the reader has to do that too. Like, it was a difficult thing to tease out how to make that narratively very interesting, but also to preserve the banality of it, because it is banal. And part of the evilness of it is that it is so banal, and that we force people of color and queer people and marginalized people to constantly do this work, to constantly be running this algorithm in the back of our minds over whether or not we have been accosted, because the white person needs us to really not be offended right now. That's part of the evil of the system. So it was difficult to find a way to render that on the page.
I mean, one of the ways that even to me really stood out, I don't know if it's something that maybe a white audience would necessarily catch, but there's this interaction that he has. There's only one other person of color in the book, as far as I'm aware, is his sort of classmate, Bridget, who is Asian. And there's this scene that they have late in the book where a lot of times throughout the beginning and throughout the book, you have one character or another, often characters saying this to Wallace, but him saying it to other people as well, that the thing that they're doing is selfish, which I think that's a really interesting thing, because I think the book kind of does take a lot of interest in what it means to be selfish and the ways in which things that we are ostensibly doing for other people are actually for ourselves. But there's this moment late in the book where he's talking to his Asian classmate, and they're sort of talking about this situation that they're in with this lab and that. And she says, yeah, it's been hard for me. And he says, has it been hard for you? And she kind of just gives him this look and gets hurt by that and says, gosh, you are being really selfish right now. And that moment really stood out to me, because to me, having that character say it made it feel completely different from all of the other times when all these privileged white characters are saying it to him. It felt more real, you know what I mean? And I thought that instance of that context, it really, I just went, oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think in fiction, what I'm always trying to do is to sort of complicate the point of sympathy for the reader. I think the novel, has sort of stood fastly on Wallace's side, even though it kind of causes him to take some punches, here or there. And one of the things I'm always afraid of is that the book sides with him too much, and that it sort of doesn't really show you the ways that he is a complicated person who is sometimes a bad friend and who sometimes just completely misses the mark because he is kind of self-obsessed. And part of his his selfishness or his self-involvement is a survival mechanism, because no one has really cared about him his entire life. But it can't just be this thing that allows him to survive and, we sort of applaud him for being so self-involved. That's going to inform all of his relationships, and it's going to create these spaces where he is an inattentive friend and where he is unable to sort of give someone what they need in the moment they need it. And so with Brigitte, she was in a complicated position, a very complicated position. And so I guess I just wanted to sort of speak truth to that just because Wallace himself is on the receiving end of these accosts doesn't mean that he's always going to be able to see when someone else is, and that he's not always going to be able to be perfect in the moment they need him to be. And so also this idea of like selfishness, like the whole book, people have been calling him selfish or implying that he's being selfish. And the book kind of sees around those accusations. But then I thought, what happens when the book can't just sort of dismiss it out of hand? Like what happens when the story has to hold Wallace accountable for the ways in which his selfishness has been a negative and has been a detriment? And so I thought it was really important to show, you know, the full range of complications of what it means for this to be his survival mechanism.
I mean, that whole thing, I think about, you know, sort of parsing out what is and isn't selfish. There are so many points in the book where it's even made fairly explicit. Like there's a time when, you know, Wallace is, he I don't know if it's even inadvertent or what. It just sort of comes out early in the book that his father has just not even recently died, that it happened a while ago and nobody knew. And then everybody sort of wants to comfort him about it. There's this moment where his friend Cole says to him, "I'm here for you. Let me be here for you." And that kind of thing, it's something that I thought you don't really see. I haven't seen that dynamic expressed so clearly. And there are little variations on that throughout the book, that dynamic of, I'm trying to do something for you, let me do it for you. Or like, I'm expressing something about you, but really I'm trying to do this for myself. Or I want to talk about this, but we need to talk about this, but actually we only need to talk about this so that you can make me feel bad about myself, kind of thing. Like all of these little variations on that same basic interaction of sort of, you know, pulling the rug out under the altruistic, you know, the ostensibly altruistic moment. It was unsettling, but also felt really, really true. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it might just be because I'm a deeply cynical person, or because you know, like I've been on the receiving end of that, you know, like I've been on the receiving end of, you know, people sort of not caring very much about me. And then the minute they find out something bad has happened, they want to be suddenly very tender and very sort of giving and loving. And it almost never has anything to do with me expressing a need for that, but a sort of recognition of some cultural script that needs to be enacted so that we can quarantine the big scary emotion. And I think I was just like really interested in reading expressions of like commiseration or like expressions of altruism, reading those very closely and trying to sort of poke at them from all sides and to sort of examine them as like the human interactions they are. Because I think sometimes we fall into this trap of thinking that, oh, what a noble gesture. And then we don't sort of investigate the noble gesture as like a human interaction with all that we know about humans and their complicated motivations. And I was just like really interested in doing a close reading of those altruistic gestures and those altruistic scripts that we have for moments. You know, it's almost like we're all walking around with like one of those rotating racks of sympathy cards that we just pull out whenever someone says something, you know, that's like the least bit emotionally sort of charged. You know, if someone says, "Oh, my father passed away," without even thinking, we just like reach into our brains and pull out the, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss." And like, no one really stops to think like, well, like, does this person, like, what was that relationship even like? Like, we presume this like range of things about these relationships based on our own experiences and based on what culture tells us. And so, you know, like a person who Wallace felt really complicated feelings about, his father is dead and he doesn't really know what to do with it. And he feels like kind of murky and ambivalent about it. But then everyone in his life is like, "Oh, this must be so devastating." You know, like they sort of overshoot his actual emotional state to sort of comfort him in a way that he doesn't need or doesn't yet has not voiced a need for. And so I was like, what is it about people that makes them do that? Like, yes, they're being nice, but it's also kind of selfish of them. And so maybe that's like a cynical take on it, but it's something that that has happened to me many times. And I just like really wanted to punch down into it and really open it up and figure out what was going on.
Yeah. I mean, I do feel like there's this thing about this that happens where you have these in this book, you have a bunch of these interactions that are sort of these, like you say, these sort of cultural scripts of very surface level. empathy that isn't really that. At the same time, I feel like the book, it also is at times reaching towards something that is a real intimacy. And there are ways that when Wallace is presented with the opportunity for something like real intimacy, he kind of pulls himself back from it. And to me, that was another thing that felt really familiar. I think that there is a way in which people who have experienced isolation or trauma can, just as a defense mechanism, you used that term before about Wallace's defense mechanisms, but there is a way in which you can kind of, in order to keep yourself from having to get hurt again. This is certainly something I've been guilty of in the past, where you can close yourself off in order to not be vulnerable, kind of thing. And I kept seeing things like that where, someone, especially Miller, I feel like the relationship between them is very complicated and very complex in a way that was really satisfying. But they'll have these moments of almost intimacy, and then you can feel Wallace kind of pushing away from it, even though you kind of feel like he's ambivalent about it. Like he kind of wants it, but he kind of doesn't want it. I just found that really interesting and really, really true.
Yeah, I mean, I think all human relationships are ambivalent at their core. I think if you drill down into any sort of relationship in your life, you will eventually find the core of ambivalence. And I guess I was just really interested in that. I mean, like you say, it's a very common thing in people who have been hurt, when they're sort of given a moment where it seems like there's a potential for genuine human connection, they can't help but to sort of second guess it, or to sort of read it too closely and to sort of see oh, this is no different from the guy at the bakery who makes my bread. This is not real deep human connection. Don't touch me. And so there is a kind of cynicism to it, I think. But, Wallace and Miller, I mean, what a strange relationship those two have. Yeah. And I think Wallace is a person who has had to sort of fend off relationships in order to survive them. And so in that moment, he's really thinking very deeply about, what does this connection mean and what does it mean about me? And he's someone who has had one version of himself, one idea of himself throughout his life. And now he's having to sort of contend with this new connection to a person he thought he knew. And he's sort of realizing that, oh, this says something very differently about me than is the version I had of myself in my head. And so, no, I must reject it outright. But then he's like, no, I do kind of like it though. And so he's wrestling with himself over both his connection to Miller and what that means about him, but also this sort of his connections to everyone is kind of up in the air, his connection to Cole, who's I think one of his closer friends, and his connection to Ingva and Brigitte and Emma. He's always thinking about what it means that he's accepting this, and will they then sort of see him differently, and will he have to remake all of his, his strategies? And I think that fear of having to remake himself is what makes him ultimately pull away, because he's just learned to survive as he is now, and he can't, he doesn't want to have to do that over again.
Well, I mean, I could keep talking about this book for several more hours, but why don't we take a little break and come back and do the second segment?
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So the thing that has been on my mind for the last, I guess, few weeks especially, is this idea of digital communities and how their role has changed throughout my life. So as an example, when I was very young, I was always going on message boards for even things I had no interest in, because it was a place where it felt like other people who were kind of like me in some way were sort of talking about things. And so, when I was younger, I was a grade A lurker. I was always reading them and sort of trying to participate by silently standing in the corner. And digital communities were just a place of solace and safety for me. And as I've gotten older, I've become part of many different kinds of digital communities. On Twitter, I feel like I went from this person who was always lurking in the corner to this person who other people were sort of looking at as an active participant in the community. And I've just been thinking a lot about how I feel like very strange about that, because I feel like some of the magic of lurking has gone out of being a part of digital communities, but also how there feels like there is this convergent note of like dread and rage in all of my communities. So like on Twitter, of course, everyone is sort of on fire all of the time, because how could you not be with the environment and the president and all the horrible things that are happening in the world. But also in sort of like the Pokemon community, there's like 17 different fires going on right now. And it feels like these spaces, which were once like places of joy, have become places where people are just angry and afraid and on fire all the time. And it feels like people sometimes look at me like, well, like, go do the dance that will make us all feel better. And I just like don't know, I don't know how to feel about being a member of these communities. And on the one hand, wanting to sort of, you know, sort of be like, but remember when we used to have fun, how to do that. And also be like, but of course we're all really sad. The world is exploding. So I guess I'm just thinking a lot about digital communities and how we're all on fire, no matter where your community is.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe part of that is just like you get to a certain point where everything in the actual world is bad enough and you can't help but see that reflected wherever people are interacting. You know, I think it's interesting because I've been participating in like chat rooms and message boards since I was in maybe middle school. So we're talking like early 90s. And it definitely feels different now. It's not just the platform, but something sort of jumped out at me about what you were saying was the way that people look to you differently now, and how it's maybe there isn't as much room for things to just be fun. I have been hosting a web forum on a website for 16 years now. And it started off as a bunch of people that I met on a different web forum. It was like an author's web forum, and we were all just sort of his fans. He has turned out to be completely awful, so most of us have sort of drifted away, drifted away from him. But I set up this web forum as just because it was people were doing it, and I thought, I want to be one of the cool kids too, and I'll make a place and we can all hang out. And about maybe 6 or 7 years into it, I just realized that it was not fun, and that I think it's just partially by nature of the fact that I was the one running it. So I had this sort of level of prestige in that community. I mean, it was not a huge community. It was maybe a few hundred people. But it seems like once you get to a certain level of authority or prestige or just sort of social clout within a group, you can't really participate in that group in the same way anymore because people won't let you. And that was something I had a really, really hard time with at the time. And it's something that I think about a lot now as, you know, I'd like to, for example, have more Twitter followers just so that I can be more effective at getting my own projects out and promoting other people's projects, things like that. But as I think about, you know, what comes with when you have a bigger following, that level of prestige starts coming around again. And it really does kind of box you in, at least in terms of people's expectations of you. It doesn't necessarily box you in terms of what you can do, but in terms of what people will let you do is, I don't know, there is something there, I think.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think a lot about certain people on Twitter who have many, many followers who just seem to want to like live their lives. And then I've heard people say things about people with many, many followers that are like, well, they're a public intellectual. They should know better than to sort of tweet so recklessly. And I'm always like, well, like they're a person. They're just like a person in the world, and they're entitled to sort of freely express themselves. Like the way that we sort of imbue people with like status and authority and like use them as a place to then project all of our anxieties about institutions onto, like that's not, you know, like on the one hand, I kind of understand it, but on the other, like it feels kind of dehumanizing. And it feels like a lot of like the ire I see in my digital communities is people who are just like people with an interest who started a website, you know, 10 years ago And now we sort of view them as an authority. And anytime anything happens with that fandom, we suddenly then use that person as like a target for all of our frustration. Like the ways in which like people within digital communities become deputized and imbued with authority, even when they may themselves be ambivalent to authority or may have no interest in it. Like there is something really strange about, you know, even though you're not a public intellectual, people may view you as one. And that feels like really like a recipe for chaos. And I feel like part of that is like why there seems to be so much like swirly fire in all of my online communities now, is that we think that everyone who has slightly more clout than we have must be an authority and they have something we want. And so now they are like this lightning rod, both for all the problems of the world and also all of our personal sort of baggage.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of bears on the novel, you know, some of the stuff that we were talking about, you know, this thing where people really do sort of project, people really do sort of understand their responses to other people in the lens of like, I'm like, oh, this person said something on Twitter and now I have to argue with them because that's what the culture kind of needs, without really stopping to think about, well, I mean, maybe what I'm actually doing here is just trying to make myself feel important. I certainly see you get a lot of that.
I mean, I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about the cheek kissing debacle, where I sort of jokingly said that if you write a scene in a novel or a story in which one character kisses another on the cheek, like that is like a false and empty move and it's fake. And people were like, how dare you discount all of our cultures? Like people acted as though I was like the president of fiction, and that I had the power to sort of strip people of their human rights. Like people accused me of genocide, and got really, really mad. And I was like, you know that I'm just like a 29-year-old with a Twitter account tweeting because he's waiting for his coffee to be made. Like I have no power to do anything. Like, why are you acting like I'm ripping your children from your arms? Like, leave me alone. But people got really upset and I had to lock my account for several days. And so like a digital community that was ostensibly about like loving books and writing and trying to be a creative and like lending each other support, like these people who came together because they love fictional worlds were suddenly being like, how dare you police us this way? And it's like, I have no power to police anyone. There is no power here. Like, there's no clout. I mean, it's sad, but I guess, you know, like with the state of the world, I mean, what can be done?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is part of it, right? Is that I think when people feel helpless, that, you know, when they feel helpless to do anything about the real problems in their lives, that they will take it out in ways where they can feel some kind of control. I think that's even just human nature. I mean, I think, you know, I got bullied a lot when I was in middle school and high school. And then later on in life, I came to realize that, you know, oh, some of those kids that were beating me up were getting beat up by their parents. And, you know, that doesn't make it right. But it's like, I guess I can kind of see where if you feel completely helpless in your life, that finding some way to feel like powerful or feel in control of something is something that might seem attractive. It would be nice if people could find ways to do that without actually harming other people. But the other thing too is that, you know, I think what a lot of people don't really reckon with in their own lives is the degree to which they really want and need approval from everybody, even people that they don't know. Like you to say something like, here is a trope in fiction that, and you know, you talk about this kind of stuff a lot, where it's like, this thing is boring or this thing is, you know, whatever. And usually you're doing it at least partially tongue in cheek, like you're just sort of fucking around, right? And even if you're not, so what? It's just you're one person. Who cares? There's still plenty. You can still read that. You can still write that. Who cares? But I think it's this thing where if you find yourself in a position where, for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, people look up to you, then even if you don't know who they are and they don't actually know who you are, they want your approval, and will, if they feel like they don't get it, will make you pay for it. You know?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's something about that also there's something about that in this idea of like we as a culture have moved toward this idea of anything that is not a consensus is violence. So if you like refuse someone consensus, you are committing an act of violence against them. I really do feel that people perceive a lack of consensus as like an existential threat. And I see it play out all the time in like digital spaces where if someone tweets, like, oh, I love this movie. And then someone sees that tweet and they're like, well, I think that movie's garbage. How dare you attack me this way? Like, there's something about like people just cannibalizing each other because we've lost our capacity to sort of be like, okay, that is your opinion. You are entitled. I'm just going to be over here with my friends. Like we can't, like there's something about culture that feels like that middle space has like gone away. And it's really scary because I think it leads to all of these fights where when someone denies you a consensus opinion, you sort of want to like change their minds really aggressively. Like, no, you have got to get on board with this because if we don't get on board, we can't build a coalition. If we can't build a coalition, we can't have change, and we need change right now more than ever, etc. Like there's just something very desperate and fierce in the air that makes me like really sad to sort of inhabit these spaces.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're just going through a time of a lot of different kinds of changes, and that's the kind of thing that makes people rightly or wrongly feel unsafe. And when people feel unsafe, they will do whatever they feel like they have to do to feel safe, even if it means being shitty to other people. I do kind of wonder whether there was ever a time when people, were okay with there not being a consensus, because I don't think there was, but I think that what the internet and social media especially have done is just made it so that those communities are bigger than they used to be, because it used to just be, I'm thinking about me. I had like 4 friends in middle school and high school. It was the same 5 of us all the way through, and we had no other friends mostly. We were all pretty rigid about like, if you weren't like going along with what the group did, then like there was something wrong, and that could play out in a number of different ways. But it was just limited to the 5 of us because we didn't have that much contact with other people, and we didn't really know what other people were saying or doing or talking about. Whereas now all of those things are happening in public and are searchable on Google, and, you just have so much more access to what people's private lives are. I think maybe that's what the difference is. Not that like there used to be a middle ground. It's just that like all of our grounds were a lot more narrow.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess like that makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess like when I say that our capacity to sort of entertain a middle space has gone out, maybe I'm sort of thinking of my own experiences. I mean, I was a person growing up who never felt at ease like in any group. Like when I was at home, everyone told me I was like too different to be like them. And when I was at school, everyone was like, well, you're kind of like us, but you're Black. So like go stand in the corner, but you can sort of sit with us. And so like I guess my life experience has always been one of like surviving difference. Like being different was never the worst thing that could happen to me. And I do wonder if part of like the intensity that I'm feeling as a person on the internet now is just that people who themselves have always been a part of the consensus are finding themselves on the outside because we're bumping up against more people than ever. And like, they just have no tools to sort of negotiate that. Like they're suddenly finding themselves marginalized in terms of their opinions or their thoughts about things. And they just like don't know what that's like. And so they're sort of needing to course correct so that they can once again belong to sort of like the central stream. But I, I never fit in even amongst my nerdy friends. Like there was always at least one degree of remove from whatever groups I occupied. And so I never felt like I had access to a consensus. And so it seems very intense all of a sudden that we're now all so intensely needing it. And so many different kinds of people are sort of begging for it. But I mean, I do think it is, as you say, like we're all in sort of a space of precarity right now. And we're just trying to reach for whatever foothold we can find.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's certainly bigger than we're going to figure out on this episode. Oh, man. Well, so, okay, there is one question that I like to close with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, today I randomly listened to Tchaikovsky's Pas de Deux from the Nutcracker, and I'd never heard it before. I mean, the Nutcracker, of course, pervades culture, but I'd never heard that part of that score before. And it's just so beautiful. And like, yes, it's like a love story. It's like a pas de deux with a dance between two people, but there's something so like melancholic about it and so true and alive. And so I was listening to it in a cafe just a little while ago and found myself like really moved and almost cried. Like it was so beautiful. It was like this thing cutting through like the noise of the world. And it just, I don't know, it felt like really alive and resonant to me. And it just like shocked me out of my malaise. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It's always such a pleasure to get to talk with you. I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
No, thank you. It was a real joy as always.
All right. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there is a link in the show notes to where you can purchase a copy of Real Life, which obviously comes with my highest recommendation. And Brandon has tour dates coming up in DC, New York, Philadelphia, Madison, and many more cities around the U.S. You can find a list of those event dates and locations on the Penguin Random House website, and there's a link in the show notes as well. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode was done by Callie Wright. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. You can find all of the show's social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechanneleopen.com. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia. A $5 monthly pledge gets you access to our bonus audio archive, which includes readings from guests of Keep the Channel Open and interviews with the authors of Likewise Fiction. Coming up next week on Likewise Fiction, I'll be featuring Acknowledgements by Maggie Shipstead, a story that just perfectly skewers a certain type of self-important but deeply insecure male writer. That will air on March 2nd, and you can find that at likewisefiction.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Keep the Channel Open will be back on March 11th with a conversation with John Sands, a poet who was also one of the co-hosts of one of my all-time favorite podcasts, The Poetry Gods. We'll be talking about his recent book, It's Not Magic, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.